Welcome to all of our attendees. Thank you and welcome, a very hearty welcome to our panelists. We pulled this together incredibly quickly and I'm so honored that you could all join us. So thank you so much for joining us today. To everyone else, good afternoon, welcome. We're so happy you're here. My name is Nicole Newman and I'm the director of the Max Kade German American Research and Resource Center at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, also known as IUPUI. Thank you for joining the Max Kade Center today for our panel discussion, Images of Insurrection. I'd like to begin our event by saying that we wish to acknowledge and honor the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee people on whose ancestral homelands and resources Indiana University was built and currently occupies. So before introducing the panelists today, I want to take a moment to introduce the Max Kade Center. We host about 3 to 5 events per academic year. And because of COVID, of course, all of these events have gone online. So you have access to all of our offerings on German and German American culture. We'd be happy to have you at the remaining spring events. In May, we're going to have an event on German American attitudes towards health in the German American press. And then we also have 2 book club offerings coming up very soon on February 27th. Our own IUPUI's own Dr. Torsten Carstensen is going to present on Peter Handke's novel Don Juan, his own version. Again, that's on February 27th. And if you would like to join us, you can come to the Max Kade website. And if you click on events down here, you can learn more about all of our event offerings and also RSVP. So we'd love to have you. Please consider checking that out. So our panel today was convened, excuse me, to discuss violent riots at the Capitol on the 6th of January, with news reports and op-eds of the day and also in the immediate aftermath, referencing the beer hall putsch, fascism and neo-fascism with links to the National Socialists, with members of the Stop the Steal rally and those who stormed the Capitol, wearing articles of clothing that expressly referenced and linked to the Holocaust and openly promoted anti-Semitism. We wanted to gather together a group of people to hold a frank discussion. While the panelists joining us here today have a sort of German studies or European studies inflection, they're also experts in the fields of media, of history, political and social movements, and race studies. So really coming from many different areas of focus and bringing that into our discussion today. And they've been invited just to have an open conversation and to react to January 6th and what they've seen in public discourse since that day. Now, before I introduce our moderator for today's panel, Dr. Todd Presner, I want to clarify the setup of today's event. Each panelist, after a brief introduction, will have about 5 minutes to introduce how they're approaching today's topic. And then we'll have an open discussion with the panelists and of course with your questions and answers and comments for the last 60 minutes or so. This is a webinar, so you'll be able to hear and, as you can tell, see the panelists, but you will not be able to interact with your fellow audience members. We ask that you use the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your screen, if you wanted to pose a question or you have a comment for our panelists. This is also being recorded and we will put that event on our Max Kade YouTube page at the end of the day. So I would also like to thank Meyer Weinschel, Kalani Michelle, and Tiffany Florville for their input in creating this event. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Todd Presner, our moderator for today's panel. He is chair of UCLA's Digital Humanities Program and Ross Professor of Germanic Languages and Comparative Literature. His research focuses on European intellectual history, the history of media, Holocaust studies, digital humanities, and cultural geography. His publications include, and there are many, so this is just a sampling, Mobile Modernity, Germans, Jews, Trains, Muscular Judaism, the Jewish Body and the Politics of Regeneration, Digital Humanities, Hypercities, Thick Mapping in the Digital Humanities, and most recently, Probing the Ethics of Holocaust Culture, which explores the history of representations of the Holocaust and contemporary debates in the field. And of course, we're hoping he'll share some of his thoughts about the imagery on the 6th with us as well. Welcome, Todd.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And it's really just such a pleasure to have this opportunity, if the pleasure is the right word, to talk about these events, with colleagues that are truly, we're engaged in these questions, these debates in our research and our teaching and our public lives, and to come together in this format and have the opportunity to really develop the tools and to help to think together, because thinking together and thinking generously is so urgent at this moment. I do want to thank the Max Kade Center and Nicole, you in particular, for bringing us together. And I hope that there's opportunity for the audience to engage to the Q&A, and that this conversation is the beginning of many important conversations that I think we all want to have, and certainly we need to have. For me, January 6th happened simultaneous with my first day of teaching. I was teaching a class that involves talking to Holocaust survivors. So it's a class on bearing witness. What my students were at noon on the Pacific Coast, we were beginning my class, and simultaneously we had our screens on. And so it was, of course, a highly mediated event, mediated by Zoom, mediated by television, mediated by our knowledge of history, our kind of epistemic investments that we had in terms of what we know and what kind of comparisons. But one of the things, and Jennifer already mentioned, or Nicole already mentioned this at the beginning, is we were trying instantaneously to develop a language for describing what we were seeing. Was this an insurrection? Was this a riot? Was this an uprising? Was this a coup? Was it a putsch? What language, what words, right, could help us to make sense of these highly mediated images that we are seeing in real time, right? And we were also seeing not just images, but there were performative actions, right? It wasn't just, they weren't static. They were moving images. They were images where we also didn't understand the temporal domain. We don't know how it was the open future, right? We don't know how it's going to end. We don't know if it's going to end. And even at this moment, we don't know if there's an ending, right? And I think this is, a really interesting question too, as we think about duration and temporality. We think about how we reference the event in terms of our historical and linguistic and cultural markers. We try to understand networks of agency and actions and reactions. We try to understand questions around authority and authoritarianism and policing. All this is to say is that we're struggling to develop a language for understanding these images, these sounds, these performances, these bodies, this history, and this moment. And so I can't imagine a more wonderfully diverse interdisciplinary panel than the one we have today to help us to think through some of these questions and many more. I'm going to go ahead and get started because we have a lot to cover. And our first speaker is going to be Jennifer Evans. Professor Evans is a historian of contemporary Germany with a diverse range of research interests, from transnational histories of sexuality, everyday life and visual culture, to the history of populism and authoritarianism, especially as it evolves across different platforms, including social media and memory. Jennifer's work has been published in many different places. She works on the websites, the New Fascism Syllabus online, as well as the German Studies Collaboratory. Her work has been supported by multiple granting agencies and institutions, from the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council in Canada to the German Academic Exchange Service. Most recently, her new project, Hate 3.0, is a multi-platform analysis of the place of historical misremembering in online populism. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to Jennifer. Thank you.
Thanks. And everybody can hear me and see me. Hey, thank you, Todd. Thanks, Nicole and the Max Kade Center for this very kind introduction, invitation, and Todd for the introduction. I'm speaking to you this afternoon from the traditional and unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, and acknowledging the land and Indigenous peoples still caught in the struggle against white supremacy in this city and in this country is an essential part, I think, of any conversation, most especially one like ours today, which explores the ways we are all implicated in complex and different ways in upholding structures of racism alongside our very best efforts to combat them. I'm hoping we can talk more about historical as well as contemporary blind spots and the urgency to tackle them in our own research and teaching. I want to take this time to show you a little bit about my research. As Todd mentioned, as an historian, I wear many hats. A large part of my work draws on queer theory and photography theory, visual culture, to analyze the social constitution and traffic of images. I've made entire arguments around one single photo, and this is going to be ironic in a way in a few minutes. I have a project on social media and post-Holocaust memory formation, what media scholar Andrew Hoskins sometimes refers to as memory that evolves on the fly, given the specific media affordances of digital communication. And now, like Todd mentioned, there's this big data project supported by the SSRC on historical analogy and the US election, part of a larger project supported by Canada's SSHRC on populist memory. So you must wonder how I got from the social constitution, travels, and agency of images to a sort of a big data project and what links the two. I'm keenly interested in how media whose operating principles we take for granted create meaning in their own right. So photography's meaning is often presumed to be transparent, and yet it's infinitely more complex. The same may be argued for social media, perhaps even to a larger degree. Although we as users, like Todd said, struggled for language around January 6th, we've become surprisingly conversant in a whole other world with everyday talk of algorithms, AI, deepfakes, dis and misinformation, platform regulation, and memes. I've come to be very aware, though, in my own research with my collaborator, Sandra Robinson, and our phenomenal graduate student, Brandon Regato, both in communications, Sandra with a background in industry, sociology, and also data science, that we historians and humanists know actually very little about the tech itself, how it works, and why it is absolutely essential to understanding moments like these that are highly mediatized affairs. And there's many ways into this material, from the preemptive commemoration of selfie takers to draw on Mariana Hirsch's arguments, to the construction of race and authoritarianism across platforms. But if we want to take the temperature of an event like the Capitol riots, how should we do so? I want to talk a little bit about imaging and imagining the insurrection in a multiple sense, because I'm interested in how social media analysis itself helps us picture or visualize events like these. I'm interested in approaches that puts the data, platform, and network front and center, as it were, especially the way it augments certain voices, images, actors, and patterns of thought and behavior. At the same time, as you'll see, I'll be making a bit of an argument about blind spots and hubris, about presuming we know more than we do, and about the work involved in doing research like this itself. So let me share the screen and show you a couple of things and hope that that works. And you all can see this now? Mm-hmm. Perfect, thank you. So what you're seeing right here is a huge Excel spreadsheet. It's one hashtag, one data set that we've collected with 74,000 tweets from just before the insurrection until now, and it's in fact ongoing. It's still collecting data. We can talk about which hashtags maybe we seized upon and looked at in the Q&A. So this is tabular data. It includes timestamp, primary and secondary and tertiary hashtags, ID, attached photos, and hyperlinks. And again, it's just one hashtag. All in all, we have harvested over 1 million individual tweets. So what can you do with this? Let me try and give you some ideas. We can clean this data and we can run it through Tableau, a program that is designed to help visualize patterns like this one, which shows the secondary hashtags that surfaced in underneath this primary hashtag of Trump coup. We can map out a time signature of tweets to think about spikes. We can do a deeper dive when we isolate, which moments in a time signature garnered a lot of tweets and a lot of activity. So we can use this as a method to call down the data sets. We can get a snapshot of users who were making the most impact, factoring in both the original tweet, retweets, mentions, and the individual size of a person's particular audience. And this hashtag Trump coup contained mostly opponents of the insurrection. And in a case like this, you can see at the very top, Citizen Revere was one of the most active, one of the most vociferous users. So this is a way of narrowing down some of the data. Because we're interested in historical analogy, we did a very preliminary cull of the data for certain keywords. And these are very basic and simple keywords that are the most self-evident when thinking about historical analogy. But as you see, these are still relatively large data sets with over 1,000 individual tweets in some cases. So how can we narrow the playing field down even further still? Time signatures, peaks, we can do content, discourse, frequency, network, and semantic analysis using tools like in vivo to code the frequency, reach, ubiquity of certain signifiers and terms, hashtags, language, and even emotions. This would allow us to visualize the affective and network dimension of civic engagement in this case, looking for mini narratives, addressivity markers, cumulative and amplified expression in what Zizi Papacharissi has called networked structures of feeling. Similarly, by looking at visual cultural markers in images, the use of filters, of font, of humor, frequency, and mobility and network, we can get at some of the same affordances. We can isolate the most popular images from the cacophony of the crowd and track what is being shared at the most popular moments in time. So it's one thing to see an image circulate in the news and become iconic, but our method seeks ways to use the data itself to make visible what is often either assumed or simply unseen amidst the noise. But again, with over 1 million tweets in our data repository, or even thousands once you whittle it down, you can appreciate how hard it is to extrapolate out generalizations. We are still witness participants to this event, not to mention that we are also operating under multiple traumas, which no doubt shape what we see. My last point is that we in this project have gathered over 500 memes from these data sets alone. How can we begin to trace what Apajurai called the social life of images, including where they migrate, how they are composed, and the agency they themselves displayed in shaping how people engaged with them, when there is just so much material? What I'm trying to say is we are operating under a series of blind spots, and we're very much at the beginning of this research to make visible what we have all experienced, but what we might not necessarily be able to see in this current place we find ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. There's so much we want to talk about, and really appreciate the perspectives of moving from the individual tweets to the larger network analysis. I'm sure we're going to come back to some of these conversations about perspective and big data. So we're going to move to our second speaker, and this is, I'm very pleased to introduce Terri Givens. Terri is the founder and CEO of Brighter Higher Ed, which she established after a successful career as a political scientist in immigration and European politics. As a former vice provost and provost, Terri has been a visionary leader in the areas of diversity in higher education. She's an advocate for improving access and opportunities for students through innovative curriculum and the effective use of educational technology. She's an accomplished speaker and uses her platform to focus on inclusive leadership and encourages personal growth through empathy. Terri has myriad publications to her name, and I'll only mention a couple, but ones which will bear directly, I think, on our conversations here. I know, and you can see a couple. I'm so glad you can show them. But Voting Radical Right in Western Europe. Thank you. Immigration, Politics, Race, and Representation in Western Europe. And forthcoming, another book actually this month, I believe. Yes. So wonderful. Radical Empathy, Finding a Path to Bridging Racial Divides. So something that absolutely I think we all need to read. Terri, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I have to say, I was as I was listening to Jennifer's talk, it forced me to go back, and I was like, oh my God, yes, there's so I feel very old because I'm going back in time to the day. There was a post on Twitter the other day talking about how the German legislation has now been digitized. And I was like, oh my God, when I was working on this book, I was going into the archives and digging out legislation and scanning it. But to keep to our topic, besides the research changes over time, so my first trip to, as a graduate student to start studying these topics was in 1995. And at the time, there was just a very different set of discourses going on. And, so what I'm going to talk about here is this idea of discourses, and I'm going to come back to my research. Well, this is all part of my research. But I just want to say that I'm working right now on a book that will hopefully be coming out in the next year, probably not till 2022, I'm guessing. But on the roots of racism. And the reason I decided to focus on that is because, back in 1995, when I was studying these things and looking at issues of immigration and race in Europe, everybody was telling me, oh, you're just coming at this from an American perspective, and there's no issues of race in Europe, especially in France. I'm sure you've all heard this before. And, the UK really was the only country that really, like the US, focused on race. And so I was like, fine, I'll study immigration politics, I'll study political parties. But then in 1999, the EU passed the Racial Equality Directive. And that was while I was in the process of, I submitted my dissertation in 1999. Which turned into the book Voting Radical Right in Western Europe. And so I was actually there studying Austria when this happened. And basically the Racial Equality Directive was a response to the rise of Jörg Haider's far-right Austrian Freedom Party. And the EU said, wait, we can't have this racist party running at one of our European countries, EU countries specifically. And so basically I feel like my career has been a very interesting intersection into these different events, which I really do think culminated in what happened on January 6th, because and I'm not going to have enough time to get into all of this. I'm going to just try to give a very 30,000 foot level overview, which is that, I've been tracking these discourses for a long time, well, basically since the mid 1990s. And we've seen this distinct shift. So first of all, there was a shift to actually acknowledging race and racism to a certain extent in Europe. And so in actually, but that wasn't mentioned, but it's very critical to all of this, is the legislating equality, because what I did is I went back to the 1980s and tracked the discourses starting, with the beginnings of discussing what was going on in Europe around xenophobic attacks. There was attacks on immigrants. In Germany, there were fire bombings of immigrant and refugee hostels. There were attacks in British, or desecrations of Jewish cemeteries, things like that. And so in this book, if you're interested in another perspective on studying the discourses, that's literally what we did in this book. Is the second chapter is all about analyzing the discourses, because we were trying to understand what was the impact of, we use Vivian Schmidt's idea around discursive institutionalism. And so we were trying to understand, why did we get from a point in the 1980s where countries like France were saying there is no such thing as race, to the year 2000 when they passed the Racial Equality Directive, and all of a sudden they're passing legislation that's requiring them to implement anti-discrimination policy that is tied to racism. And so we studied all of the different discourses over time and saw how basically, I should have created a slide, but basically I can show that really big increase is in an increase in the term, using the term discrimination, and then racism is also moderate. But this idea of approaching it from an issue of discrimination was an interesting development, and probably part of the reason why we see this shift to a focus on anti-discrimination policy. So then the book goes on to discuss why it wasn't implemented properly, and that's because you had you had left-leaning governments in the late 1990s, and then a shift to right-leaning governments in the early 2000s. And what I try to talk about in the Roots of Racism book, which I could talk for hours about, but I'll try not to, is that we see these transatlantic ties. And so actually, I think around, I was looking up to see what year it was, but I think around 2008 or 2010, we did a conference at UT Austin on these transatlantic ties, but the focus at that time was Islamophobia. And what's interesting to me is how we've seen this shift away from the discussion of Islam. I mean, you don't hear people talking much about Muslims or Islam, at this moment, except for from the right and, to a certain extent. But, I'm still trying to understand, since that time, in the mid 2010 time period, there was this huge focus on Muslims and terrorism. And even Trump's one of his first acts was a Muslim ban. And yet, then the focus shift to immigration. And now we're seeing this focus, of course, on the far right and far right terror and so on. And so I think that's a really interesting development in and of itself. But the other thing I'll mention in wrapping up is to say that one of the things that, pushed me to, start thinking about this was around 2007, 2008, you had three, mainstream politicians claiming in France, Germany, and the UK that multiculturalism was dead. It was like they had coordinated and they said, okay, we have to do something about this. We're going to say multiculturalism is dead. And so I think, there's been this ongoing trend since the early 2000s of a shift towards saying, multiculturalism doesn't work. We can't integrate these people. We have to keep them out. And then that's feeding into the right-wing discourses and right-wing violence that we've seen in Germany and UK, and of course here in the US. And we could, I'm sure we'll be talking about many of the things that have led up to what we saw on January 6th. But I just want to put that in broader context. And of course, I'm happy to talk in more detail as we go along. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Terri. And I think underscoring the transatlantic ties will be something that we definitely will want to come back to, and understanding those ties historically, as you've indicated, is something that we really need to confront. I do want to remark that looking back at Jennifer's tweets, remembering that Nazi, Hitler, and fascism were among the highest examples of tweets that are there. And so it's interesting too that part of the transatlantic ties are obviously happening via social media and these networks that we're trying to understand. They're deeper networks, as you indicate, and they are historically much longer in terms of legislation and other activities. So let me go ahead and introduce our third speaker, and this is Adrienne Merritt, who received her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and is visiting assistant professor at St. Olaf College. Her wide-ranging research spans Black German studies to Pan-Germanic medieval studies, as well as queer, anti-racist, and decolonial theories and studies. In addition to her wide-ranging research, Dr. Merritt serves on the steering committee for the Diversity, Decolonization, and the German Curriculum Collective, and on the executive committee for the MLA Germanic Philology and Linguistics Group. It's a great pleasure to welcome you, Dr. Merritt, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Todd, for the introduction, and also thank you to Nicole for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I'm speaking today from the unceded and traditional homelands of the Wapikute Band of the Dakota Nation, upon which St. Olaf currently stands. I thank them for their stewardship and recognize the historical and current injustices that continue to enact violence against and trauma on the people of the Dakota Nation. It is not lost to me that lands that were once the homelands of the Dakota Nation are now being used by a predominantly white, small liberal arts college of a Norwegian and Lutheran tradition. The legacy of the Germanic, veiled in whiteness, is really at the heart of my talking points today. I was trained as a Pan-Germanic medievalist, studying everything from Old Norse to Middle High German. That training informs on several levels my approach to this panel, Images of Insurrection, both through language and visual image. In thinking about how to respond to the topic of this panel today, I was really drawn first to the words and their history, in particular in the title, the first word, images, and how those words figure largely into how I'm going to respond to this. for me, thinking about it as trained as a philologist in particular, thinking about words and their history and how they develop and how they form and fit into this is really kind of a way of I feel like opening up some of these connections to the medieval, and kind of thinking about image, thinking of from the Latin word imago, right, by way of an old French word of the same spelling. Appears in Middle English in around the early 13th century, and originally meant kind of a piece of statuary, an artificial representation that looks like a person or a thing. Right? The Latin root from which image was developed also held the meaning of phantom, ghost, apparition, whereas the verb imitare can be translated as to copy, imitate, from which the word in English is derived. At the same time, image connects to the related word imagination, imagined, imaginative. I focus on this word because for me, images of insurrection inevitably connects to an ongoing imaginary, something constructed that has fueled innovation and development, but also the subjugation of Black and brown bodies, an imagined white supremacy, an imagined threat to the definition and core values of US American identity. I recently spoke at the Race Before Race conference, citing that the legacy of imagined supremacy, from which I would argue white supremacy developed, has a much longer and deeper history than we often give it credit. And that talk specifically, I tied the significance of the white imagination and to how it shaped and constructed mixed race and Black characters in Parzival. And one look at images from the insurrection shows that that imagined supremacy, as outlined in Germanic medieval literary traditions, is still very much alive today. In particular, the figure of Jacob Chansey, also known as Jake and Jelly, a Trump supporter and QAnon conspiracy believer, weighed the most heavily for me. Taking stock of the image he wished to portray within the Capitol as both a mix of both the visual and the visual imaginary, literally tattooed on his skin. As Tom Burkett outlined in his January 13th article, Chansey's body details his politics through his tattoos, relying upon heavy symbolism from Norse mythology that is often tied to white supremacist and or nationalist groups. I'm going to share a few slides about that right now. So, okay, can everybody see this? Yes, okay, good. I'm not going to do the present function because then it's always back and forth, and it kind of this I think is large enough. So here's the image of Jacob Chansey, and I think that it's important to note is that I was struck by a lot of layerings of imaginaries when looking at him, how he was presenting himself. But also there are these characteristics, and I'm going to go through this piece by piece, some of these things, detailing a bit, kind of to summarize what was in the Burkett article, but also to connect it to pop culture figures, which I think also is fueling this imaginary. And just as a side note, this person here, you can, from what I can tell, has a braided beard. Again, these are tropes that are borrowed from, from Tolkien, from other fantasy novels, and how these were then developed, in cinematic adaptations. These are ongoing presents that occur from everything from Magic the Gathering cards to D&D to other things. These are very much used and recreated again and again. And kind of looking at this, I was thinking, first thing that struck me was thinking about this horned helmet, which is not really a horned helmet per se. It's a layering of kind of a borrowing from what people might call Viking, which is often misused, but a medieval Scandinavian culture, which is not what it derives from, and then almost like American frontier of the fur hat. So and what also struck me is thinking about the connection to Wagnerian costume, which is really where these horned helmets are coming from, which of course has its ties to white supremacy. So through these even through his hat, even through something as simple as one article of clothing, there's an awful lot of layers that are depicted here. And one thing that I also noticed was his face painting, which automatically made me think of Braveheart, right? There is an aspect of a warrior stance. He is there, as you see here, he's not wearing a shirt, it's painted, he's tattooed. These are things that this imaginary, again, through pop culture, it proliferates through a variety of things, from, of course, from memes, or as Jennifer already had mentioned, social media. But a couple of other things of looking through these tattoos, of thinking of, so Mjolnir, right, Thor's hammer, is very prominently on his stomach here, which of course Tom Burkett's article has outlined. I'm not good, I would highly recommend this in terms of breaking down what all of these mean and the connections, because I think it's very helpful. But then again, this also connects to a popular culture imaginary, this idea of Thor, and particularly one of the last Marvel films, the second film from the Infinity Wars, he becomes this hero type character. So again, there is this crossing over of not only the medieval, but to popularize this neo-medieval that is kind of reenacted through white supremacy and conspiracy groups. Another tattoo on more on his chest is Yggdrasil, right? Which is a central sacred tree in Norse cosmology. This also figured very largely in the game God of War that was released on PlayStation. So this became the central kind of hub within the game. These are things that this terminology was kind of weaving in and out, not only from white supremacist groups and other nationalist groups, but also into gameplay, into things that people are doing in their free time, which this is, I guess I'd say this is a very precarious road that we're traveling, because these symbols are showing up everywhere, but we're not necessarily connecting and confronting all of them to white supremacy because they are being used in various ways. The last tattoo here, the Valknut, which is actually a modern term, but that has been connected to various medieval Germanic and archaeological finds. And it's connected often to burial with honor, but there's a variety of uses for this, so it's difficult to pinpoint. So in kind of summarizing these points, I guess for me, what is crucial to point out is that the image, in particular of Jacob Chanzy, is a performance of an imagined supremacy, an imagined lineage to a Germanic past that is not easily overlooked nor forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adrienne. Such a rich talk, and the emphasis here on both the performative and the appropriation of these various traditions, including indigenous traditions and neo-medieval traditions, is such an important part of beginning to help us unpack the power of this imagery and the ways in which it's been woven together across popular media, gameplay, and of course the performative dimensions, the violent performative dimensions of the insurrection. I hope that we'll have a chance to explore this a little bit more, and thank you so much. We're going to turn to our fourth speaker, and that is Eric Roubinek. Eric Roubinek is an assistant professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Asheville. He received his PhD in modern European history from the University of Minnesota in 2014, and is the recipient of numerous research grants and fellowships, including multiple DAAD fellowships and a FLAS fellowship from the US Department of Education and Defense. His research interests lie at the intersection of German, cultural, and transnational history, and at present he's completing a monograph on the collaboration between Nazi Germany and fascist Italy in planning an African empire. He's the co-editor of the Weimar Republic, 1918-19, and the German Historical Institute's German History in Documents and Images series, and also the recent special issue, Fascism and Anti-Fascism Since 1945, which is part of Radical History Review. Further publications have appeared in edited volumes on Nazi science in Southern Europe and Nazi occupied Europe. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Dr. Roubinek. Thank you.
Now I'm unmuted. Thank you, Todd, for that kind introduction. And since we're waving books, I am excited that this special issue is finally out. And indeed, this issue on fascism and anti-fascism since 1945 has largely influenced how I'm approaching this topic today. For indeed, my own research is much more focused on the limited notion of fascism that ends in 1945. So working on this special issue helped me to rethink that, as well as a recent course I taught to undergrads, thinking about historical fascism and questioning the validity or the utility of a contemporary fascism, both in the United States and elsewhere. So I wanted to thank Nicole as well for inviting me to speak today. And I will say that I had some initial trepidation about speaking today about the events of January 6th at this forum. And not least because Nicole said I only had 5 minutes, so I'll try and keep my talk short. But also I was reminded, she wanted me to speak as a historian, and I was reminded of one of my mentors who in the fall semester of 1989 was teaching a course on modern Germany. He had just spent several days speaking about East Germany, the stability of the regime, and the stability of the Berlin Wall. For those of you perhaps too young to remember, that wall came down before he finished the semester. Perhaps then, needless to say, I am a bit skeptical about historians' ability to predict the future, right? To prognosticate. I will leave that to the political scientists in the room. That said, I do think that historians bring an important perspective and should play a significant role in how we contextualize the present, including the events of January 6th. Terminology, right? The language that we use to discuss this is but one example. Certainly, it seems to me that the terms Nazi and fascist have been waged with greater frequency since January 6th and over the last 4 years in general, both by learned scholars and the general media alike. Many scholars even breathed a sigh of relief recently when the eminent historian of fascism, Robert Paxton, finally declared Trump a bona fide fascist after the events early last month. And in part, many of us know about this, not only because we read, but because of Jennifer's excellent work on the new fascism syllabus, where we discuss these events. Up until recently, just a few weeks ago, Paxton had been one of the final holdouts on using that term, right, fascist, to define the Trump regime. For some, as many of us are familiar with, the Yale philosopher Jason Stanley, Paxton's hesitancy to label Trump a fascist is the problem with such a strict definition of fascism that leads us to only be able to identify it after the fact. It loses its utility, right? When only when it is too late to do something about it, when we stick to this strict historical definition. Now, while I'm completely sympathetic to the anti-fascist stance that Stanley and others take, I would like here to caution us about clinging too closely to labels and terminology. Already during the election cycle in 2016, historians of modern Germany were warning us of the MAGA movement without needing to resort to the F word. Jeffrey Herf, for example, had declared that what we were witnessing at that time, 2016, was not exactly fascism, at least not yet. But regardless of how well that term fit, he noted, quote, there was still plenty of room for discomfort. Without that term, we should be concerned. Writing of Trump in 2016, the British historian of fascism, Roger Griffin, was a bit more pointed. Quote, you can be a total xenophobic, racist, male chauvinist bastard and still not be a fascist, end quote. I would argue then that we need not the label of Nazism or fascism for us to be concerned citizens. It seems to me that applying terms like racist, xenophobic, anti-democratic, or even seditious should sufficiently raise our concerns. I would also like to suggest that uncritical, oversimplified comparisons to Hitler's Germany often obscure more than they do to illuminate our present. In the past month, there have been numerous comparisons to the events of January 6th to Hitler's failed beer hall putsch of 1923. To not spend much time to talk about the vast differences between the political landscape of Bavaria and Germany in 1923 versus the US in 2021, it seems to me that the importance of the failed coup attempt was that Hitler was kept from power and as a result, developed a plan whereby he could come to power legally some 10 years later. It would seem to me then, if German history is to be insightful, we might be better Or you might try better to understand what enabled Trump to come to power legally in the first place in 2016. Why didn't he need a coup? I share similar concerns over Governor Schwarzenegger's claim, maybe you've seen his video, that the January 6th events can best be compared to Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, during which Nazis destroyed Jewish businesses, burned synagogues, and some tens of thousands of German Jews were arrested. The pogrom was state-sponsored and occurred some 5 years into Nazi rule. It was not a coup d'etat, but rather a demonstration of violence by a regime already very much in power. Now, labels and comparisons to a Nazi past are powerful precisely because we all know, I hope, that Nazis are bad. But I fear that focusing too much on another country's past too easily allows us to ignore our own American history. We should remember that Nazis drew from the work of the Ku Klux Klan and the Jim Crow South as they developed their racial racist policies. While we had a limited branch of the Nazi Party in the US, we also had our homegrown fascism, such as the Silver Shirts and other fascist-like movements. Just how easily some of these ideas could develop in the US and take on American peculiarities was the focus of Sinclair Lewis's novel, It Can't Happen Here. For those of you who haven't read it, his point is precisely that it can. It also strikes me that we need not look to Germany for examples of insurrections or attempted coups. Rather, we might first look to Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, when a democratically elected government was overthrown by white supremacist Democrats, a history that is far too unknown, even amongst my own students, even those who were born and raised in Wilmington. Alas, I do think that we can learn a lot about the American president from studying Germany's past, and I look forward to our conversation today. I'm already excited by everyone's presentations. But I do think, as a critically engaged public, we should be conscious of both the similarities and differences between now and then. Despite all these wonderful connections that my colleagues have outlined, I'd like to remind us here, I think it goes without saying, but I'm going to repeat it, that with or without Nazis, the attacks on our democracy last month should have us concerned. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Eric. And this was such an important intervention alongside the others that we've already had. I do hope that this issue around transatlantic lineages of white supremacy will be a key component of our conversation. It seems that looking only to Germany and not looking deeply at the US past, particularly the history of miscegenation laws, the history of Jim Crow laws, of voter disenfranchisement, the history of racial violence, anti-Black violence, but also indigenous violence, is absolutely critical. And so we need to look deeply at home as well as look deeply abroad. I hope that we can do both of those things. So I'm very excited to actually return to our fifth speaker, and I'm going to introduce Johanna Schuster-Craig, and she is assistant professor of German and Global Studies at Michigan State University. She's published numerous articles in German studies journals. I'll list a couple: Feminist German Studies, German Studies Review, German Life and Letters, and her recent work, Resisting Integration, Neukölln Artists' Responses to Integration Politics, appeared in a book, an edited volume called Cultural Topographies of the New Berlin. She's writing a book currently about integration discourse and the far right, and she teaches a range of courses at Michigan State University on German identity and refugee migration across the globe. It's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Schuster-Craig, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm pretty sure I sent Todd a sentence, and so he actually did more work to expand that. So I'm thankful for it. It has been fascinating to listen to all the different kinds of styles of presentation that are coming from our different backgrounds. And I am going to speak more freely about some of the difficulties I had picking something to talk about in this particular format, as well as some of the things that I'm really interested in. And in terms of what I am trying to deal with in terms of what we call the insurrection, I was very happy to hear Todd say at the beginning that we don't know when this is going to end, because when I was trying to restrict my subject matter to January 6th, I found that I couldn't do it because all of the things that we were seeing on the 6th that were interesting to me showed up again on the 13th when we had the impeachment vote. And then today is actually the day where Marjorie Taylor Greene is being debated about whether or not she will be stripped of her committee assignments. So for my interest, which right now is turning to far-right women and the way that elite leadership in the party that is held by women has some very specific contours. I actually know that, Terri, I'm familiar with your work because of some of the early stuff you did on the gender gap, which is really very interesting and quite different than mainstream political science was dealing with at that time. So I just want to thank you for doing that work so that I can now come and do this work. One of the things that's really interesting to me in a German context and that I've spent some time researching are the statements made by female politicians and how utterly queer they are as bodies, as figures to be leading the German far right. So I have looked at statements by Alice Weidel and Frauke Petri and Beatrix von Storch. And one of the conclusions I'm coming to is that especially when you have women in positions of leadership with a far right political attitude, they tend to be more extreme than the men. And this makes sense because they have to be in order to rise to that level of power, right? These are misogynistic parties that do not have a place for women in them, but women can kind of thwart the path of entry by destabilizing their own queerness, sometimes in displacing that with more extreme and radical points of view. And so when I was thinking about the kind of broad research and disciplinary background that I'm interested in, I'm really interested in politicized speech and political speech. And then I want to know how, through performances, whether those are mediated or direct, how does that speech move? How do those discourses change over time? How does the knowledge production get shaped by the way that certain kind of linguistic elements or rhetorical elements get repackaged and transmitted? So Adrienne, I was really interested to see these popular culture overlaps with a lot of the symbology, but also in Jennifer's format, we can track through hashtags, which are both maybe a curse and an incredible tool, how this language and rhetoric is moving. And I agree fully with Eric in terms of, we need to be thinking about also what historical context these linguistic shifts happen in. So one of the things that was really interesting for me in the events of the 6th, but then the 13th, and then over and over again, is the way that the violence of January 6th and those images were so masculine, with the exception of the woman who got maced, right, that became a viral meme, and the one, who left Mima at the Capitol. Those two images have circulated in different ways, but the majority have been of very rough and manly men breaching the Capitol. And then you have the boring parliamentary procedure that, if you're looking for subtlety, is just as interesting in the performance of what people do, but you have to be very, very patient in order to garner meaning from those images. Most people are not particularly interested. And I think the one that really turned into a viral meme itself was Marjorie Taylor Greene wearing a censored mask while she gave a statement on the 13th about impeachment and was being broadcast on every major network, because that kind of contradiction was just so obvious to everyone. But there are other things that are not quite as masterful, and I probably shouldn't use that word. There are other performances that do not successfully convey that kind of interest through the mediated experience, like Lauren Boebert's speech on January 13th in terms of the impeachment vote, where I would say the delivery is flawed, the rhetoric is contradictory, but there's an interesting thing happening there where the political speech is moving. So if you look at her speech, she ends that speech against the impeachment vote by saying, "I call bullcrap on the Democrats." And so one of the things that I heard when I was listening to that on the radio was an appropriation of the Parkland slogans, the Emma Gonzalez speech where she talks about, I call BS. And now we have appropriation functioning as a method for moving that discourse into different political hands and different political actors. And so those are the kinds of things that, are hard to talk about in the context of images, because so much of it is this composite image, rhetoric, and then intent that we're all trying to look at ahead, you know, all at once. So I'll stop there, but those are some of the ideas that are really interesting to me.
Fantastic. And I think, you know, just to flag two of the things that you said at the end, I hope that we'll have a chance to come back to. And one is the issue around the composite nature of the images. So the layering effect of taking all these different histories, amalgamating them, moving them together, and of course, dehistoricizing them at the same time, or rehistoricizing them in new ways. And the other is appropriation, right? So there's an appropriation both of images and histories, reappropriation, misappropriation, and I hope we have a chance to kind of think through some of those issues as well. So our final speaker, and I'm very pleased to introduce, is Johannes von Moltke. He is professor of German studies and film, television, and media at the University of Michigan. His book publications include The Curious Humanist, Siegfried Kracauer in America, and No Place Like Home, Locations of Heimat in German Cinema. His most recent work, in some of his most recent work, von Moltke has been following the social media tactics of the populist right on both sides of the Atlantic, with a particular focus on how cultural Marxism has spun a conspiracy theory around the Frankfurt School. He presented his initial findings at the 2019 German Studies Association Distinguished Lecture, The Meme is the Message, Alt-Right, Neue Rechte, and the Political Affordances of Social Media, as well as in two recent op-ed pieces, one of which was co-authored with Johanna Schuster-Craig, which appeared in Geschichte der Gegenwart, History of the Present. I'm going to go ahead and give the floor over to Professor Johannes von Moltke.
Thanks, Todd.
Yep.
And thanks, Nicole, for the invitation and for putting this together. I think this is one of the affordances of Zoom media, which is really exciting. I'm also aware that after lots of really, really interesting contributions, I stand between these and the conversation. So I'm going to try to keep it short, and especially since I feel like some of what I prepared to say restates some of what already has been said. Todd's introduction outlined some of the places that I'm coming at this question from, which I would detail as three kind of different vantage points. One is my interest in social media and a particular interest in the conspiracy theory of cultural Marxism. The second is the work that Johanna and I did together, thinking through the place of analogy and comparison. Our kind of more granular look was at social media, but in the background was the discussion that Eric already outlined about the fascism comparison. So I'll come back to that very briefly. And the third is my interest in critical theory and its various theorizations of fascism and culture. And I do remain interested, or I'm interested again, in what critical theory and historical analyses of fascism can help us to see in the present. So I'll take those three angles in turn and try to keep it brief. I have a few images to share to help orient this. So on the question of the social media and memes that come basically into real life, as Adrienne already illustrated much more carefully than I can here. Some articles in the press have picked apart these memes, as Adrienne also mentioned. Here I have examples from gamer culture, the development of Pepe the Frog, and the Kekistan flag, which evokes the Nazi flag, but kind of trolls it or is for the lulz, basically. Here the riot brought these basically from online into real life. And so my interest is actually less about the specific memes, although I think we need those kinds of analyses, again, like Adrienne was showing us, than to think about the amazing success story that this is for the alt-right. If you think that the alt-right, one way of periodizing it is it starts with an attempt to what they call move the Overton window, creating conspiracy theories like the cultural Marxist one, which are all designed to capture the cultural imagination, like Adrienne was saying, and and the discourse. They have terms for this. They call it metapolitics, and they have a moniker that Andrew Breitbart coined, which is that politics is downstream from culture, which is a pretty thought-provoking and radical idea. And it seems if politics is downstream from culture, then the capital was the estuary. And we've arrived at the moment where the cultural redefinition comes into full political view. So one way of telling the story to me is to say that the mimetic politics of the alt-right are coming to fruition. I'm not telling anything new in that way, but I think it's important to keep that in mind. Second, on the question of analogies, again, I'm not going to say a lot more than Eric already said here. We could do endless catalogs by now of the March on Rome, the Munich Beer Hall Putsch, the stab in the back myth, the elections of '33, the Reichstag fire, Kristallnacht, etc. Others dispute these analogies for reasons that Eric already laid out. It's like a game of ping pong where people are trying to score points, and it seems to be a very male game, which is kind of interesting to me. Except for Ruth Ben-Ghiat, I don't see, really a lot of female historians taking an interest in staking a claim here, whereas the men seem very, very invested in it in parts. John Caitlin, who I saw is in the group, has tracked that in interesting ways. So my question is really what's at stake in the game, and again, Eric already outlined a few things, and I think you also said you said exactly right how we shouldn't overinvest in the terminology here, but I think it helps to think about it as a discourse that is concerned with democracy, and in that sense, we need to take it very seriously. It's concerned with American democracy, with its racist foundations, with its fragility, and with what political scientists, I'm not one, but I think call democratic backsliding. Like Eric, I would say that these comparisons and analogies are helpful as long as we keep in mind that they obscure as much as they can reveal. And I do take very seriously, as does Eric, the concern that drawing Nazi comparisons can give the satisfaction of outsourcing fascism, or the feeling that it's over there. And in this sense, I too would like to come back, as Todd said, to the conversation about the transatlantic conversation and the American roots of fascism that scholars like Whitman have shown, that Toni Morrison and W.E. Du Bois talk about, and that would lead us to rethinking Reconstruction more than the Nazi era in some ways. On the issue of democracy, we all saw the Confederate flag in the Capitol, and we should talk about that if we're talking about images. But there's another flag that really stopped me, which is the American flag with Trump on it. Half an hour before this image was taken, or an hour or two, Don Trump Jr. said, the Republican Party is no longer the Republican Party, it's Donald Trump's party. Here's a flag that says the American nation is no longer an American polity, it's not a republic, it's Donald Trump's nation. This is the Führerprinzip. That's overstating it. It's another F word, and it has the same problems as calling things fascist. But at the same time, if we're thinking about democracy, this is what I think we need to be looking at. And then my third take on this has to do with critical theory. And we could spend all afternoon talking about it for all I care, but I'm going to pick one aspect, and that is the discussion of authoritarianism, which often is used to describe this. And that has its sources, among other things, in the study on the authoritarian personality. And I've come to be concerned with the fact that often authoritarianism is taken as a shorthand for Trump or the autocrats or strongmen, that's Ben-Ghiat's term, that lead totalitarian regimes. The study from the 1940s, the authoritarian personality, was about the adherents, not the leaders, right? People who have authoritarian personalities aren't the autocrats. They are the people who enable and who desire authoritarian leadership. And that that I think is really something we also need to be paying attention to. This is a study that came out in The Atlantic just a few days ago from Chicago professors, basically saying, and this was the object of the authoritarian personality as a study in the 40s, was to say authoritarianism is inside democracy. It's not its other, it's not the outside. And that's a position, of course, that the Frankfurt School really pushes over and over again, that the threat to democracy is inside democracy. Rather than something, again, we could outsource across the Atlantic or to a different kind of regime or polity. Having said all that, I'll also say that, of course, these kinds of studies, when they come from the Frankfurt School, have the recurring blind spot of race. And that what I said before about what the limits of looking to fascism are over there are the same limits of looking to the Frankfurt School, because it doesn't account in a robust way for the fact that this is a racist moment and the assertion of white supremacy in the capital of American democracy. And that's where I'll end. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Johannes, and thank you all to the panelists for these extraordinary comments, interventions, perspectives, and really you can see how many of them intersect and build on one another. In terms of our next step in our webinar, I'm going to open up to the panelists to actually give a chance for them to respond to one another, because there's a number of overlapping and intersectional issues already raised. And I also want to say that we'll collect questions from the audience. So if you put them into the Q&A, Nicole and I will collate and collect them, and then we'll also present those back to the panelists. And in terms of time, we have about 25 or so minutes together. So let me go ahead and open up to the panelists and see if anyone would like to respond. And Terri, I see your hand, so you're first.
I have so much I could say, but it's really interesting because back in the late 90s, early 2000s, I was trying to connect. So one of the things I did, I think that was novel, was to focus on the parties, and that these far-right parties were working within the political systems of these countries. And it was really difficult at the time to connect the voters to this idea of authoritarianism, because the data just wasn't there. But I do think that was an important component of it. I do talk about the leadership of these parties, so that was important. But one of the things I made a comment and then to the other panelists is that these images also had the history is important, because these images had a very visceral impact for African Americans, because you see the mob, you see the noose, and it was meant to have that impact, right? I mean, they use these images and the tattoos and all of these things because they are trying to instill fear and to also bring back these memories of the crowds that would have picnics at lynchings so this is all tied very much historically, which is why I see, and that unfortunately it's not going to come out for another year or so, but this book I'm working on right now about the roots of racism as being a corrective to this idea that race has not played and this is the problem in political science, right? And why my work was kind of on the edges of political science when I started, because race and gender were not seen as being important to politics. I'm not saying that's across the board. I'm just saying in general. And so, the fact that my first article that was on the radical right gender gap, at the time I thought somebody must have talked, and that's that people didn't talk about it at all, but there was no systematic, discussion of it. So anyway, there's so much I could talk about, but I do think the imagery and the history are two key critical components, because the far right is using these images in order to impact the discourses.
Absolutely. I just wanted to flag one thing that you said. I think it really is something that hasn't been talked about as much, but it's the images with the crowds. And one of the things about the history of lynching photographs is the crowds. And so it's the fact that you take a picture and it's circulated widely among family members or friends or what have you, but it's the number of people that are there with the event of the lynching, right? It's the number of people that are there with the noose, with the Confederate flag. And I think that has this effect of also creating a kind of a discourse of, we are all behind this. And the image functions much differently than if it was an image without the crowds. So I'm so glad that point was made about the history of lynching photographs. Jennifer, I think your hand was up next, so I'm going to turn to you.
Thanks. No, one of the things that I kept hearing over and over again, it was in Terry's talk and Adrienne's talk in Johanna's, was again this question of transatlantic connections and the centrality of Nazism to all of this. And I guess, you know, as a Canadian who is just so intensely aware of the fact that white supremacy is not a historical thing here and there where you are, but it is, you know, part of our present. And so I'm just extremely interested in what is both visible, right, in these images, but then also what is invisible. So thinking about the invisibilization of Indigenous ongoing practices of genocide against them, looking at January 20th, the inauguration, and seeing an absolute absence of any kind of acknowledgement that there was another layer to this entire story. So I find that really interesting. And not to Canada out of the, you know, not to make us look self-righteous and so aware and woke, because of course we're not, right? The Proud Boys are our Canadian creation. Gavin McGuinness, we gave to you. I know you're really thankful. The incel movement is also, both I should say, are products of my university, which is probably not something they put on their website very often. Gavin McGuinness got a master's degree in English at Carleton, and the incel movement has a slightly different origin story. All this is to say, I think boundaries and borders are important, right, for sort of helping us categorize and make sense of the past. But these issues obviously know no boundary, and they travel and traffic across borders and boundaries and are part of our collective present as opposed to just the past. So I wanted to throw that out there as well.
Good. Other panelists, Johanna?
I just wanted to pick up on something that Jennifer said. I had no idea that the incel movement was from Canada, but I do have memories of listening to a podcast that its origins are actually in queer female-bodied folks, that the term was created by someone who was trying to give words to their experience, and that it then became appropriated through the internet in moving in different ways. And one of the things I was wondering at Carleton, one of the things I was wondering is if maybe other folks had more enlightened, I don't know, anything to say about the way that intent figures into this, but also what the role is with private social media companies controlling what used to be a more public sphere. And if we could maybe also talk about that, if we're going to talk about mediating images, what does it mean to have private control over something that used to be considered public? We certainly have people on this panel. I'm thinking of Johannes. I mean, the culture industry is ripe there for theoretical appropriation. But also, you know, anybody working on free speech issues, I feel like is coming up against a rock and a hard place right now in terms of the misinformation claims dropped dramatically once President Trump and some of his main influencers were banned from Twitter. And then to what degree the Capitol uprising can thank its organizational prowess because it was able to harness this kinds of space. And there's so many arguments that could be had right now, but you know, if we're interested in how speech travels, also I'm interested in this very unique American experience that does not exist in Germany, where there really is a free pass, right? We can say whatever hurtful and hateful things to each other because of Supreme Court precedent. And I don't have any answers to these questions. These are like literally the questions I'm struggling with in my mind right now. Yeah, Johannes throws up his hands. All right. Okay.
Johannes, do you want to respond on that in addition to your hands?
Did I even dare? I mean, I except to say that I completely agree, and that that these are the questions. They're open. Obviously, the debates about Facebook, Twitter, and regulation and oversight committees, et cetera, are ones that need to be had. I think we're way too scared of having them. It's not like the United States has no history of regulating big corporations, of breaking them apart, of dealing with monopolies. All those kinds of things could be going on. One distinction that to me has been very useful in analytically, although it's not going to do political work in, you know, like in terms of regulation, but is to ask is free speech weaponized, right? Where are the moments where free speech is designed to be a weapon and to make people cower or retreat or betray themselves, right? And you see this in groups like Turning Points USA, you know, all the attempts to come into the academy and say, we are being robbed of our free speech. To me, are weaponizations of free speech. They are spearheads that are launched at the academy and that run straight into academic freedom. And I don't think we've fully discussed that. And I don't think as higher education, we're good enough on it yet.
No, and I want to chime in because I've been working on this topic somewhat. And it really goes back to the 1980s and deregulation and losing the fair, whatever doctrine, fair practices doctrine. And so we need to do more research on that, right? I mean, I think even as academics, there hasn't been enough focus on how this has developed over time because it is impacting the discourses, not only, but it is an issue in Europe, obviously, you know, in France and in Germany, you see these, and in the UK, I mean, you can go back to the issues about the Holocaust and Holocaust denial. I mean, that's one of the classic examples of how this is weaponized very differently across the Atlantic, but it's also an impact of the transatlantic approach to this. And really, you know, I always say that the left has been very behind in terms of understanding what's happening with this, and that it goes back to at least to the, and it goes further than that, of course, but you know, the 1980s was a critical time period when the right was consolidating their attempts to undermine the academy as well as the media and utilize it in ways to get their messages across, that, and using free speech as a way to do that.
Oh, thank you. And I noticed there's actually a question in the Q&A around the transatlantic. I'll say that question real quick, but I also want to give Adrienne and Eric a chance to chime in. One of the questions, and maybe I'll just reframe it slightly, is whether the transatlantic is not just, you know, the European transatlantic, Germany and France we've talked about, but where we might look at other places. So Turkey, Chile, Argentina, certainly Canada. And so we need to think maybe in terms of other networks of how lineages around white supremacy are also operating in really a range of different ways. But let me open up just again to Eric and Adrienne if you wanted to speak to either this issue or any other issue that's already been raised. So
I can find my unmute button. Going back to this idea of connections, whether they be transatlantic or other global connections, this is another case where I think fascism obscures more than it reveals. And it's a question of, are we talking about a history of white supremacy? Are we talking about a history of racism, of racist politics? Are we talking about authoritarianism more generally? How we lay out those terms dictates the connections that we're going to see. And I think they are all very valuable, but we should perhaps consider more clearly, what is it we want to see? Or going back to some of the memes and social media posts that Jennifer spoke about, that Johanna spoke about, that Adrienne spoke about, when these actors of the alt-right invoke certain flags, when they invoke certain images, what is the intention behind it? Why is there an intention to evoke or invoke a swastika? Is it about Nazi racism? Why is that the symbol rather than, what is it, the Virginia battle flag, the stars and bars? What causes them to associate their racist, if that's their primary ideology, with that image rather than something from America's past? And I think those are still important questions to be considered.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree, especially looking at some of the images that Johannes showed there. I think that there's a layering to focus too much on international connections is to deny the overwhelming amount of American connections that were present. I mean, you know, even with the example of like the Davy Crockett hat with horns. I mean, that's an American-born version of this, and that's particularly why, like, for me, this is about an imagination. This isn't about particularly specific connections. At least this is what I would argue. There are connections, of course, between these groups, but the specific usage of this is a homeborn imagination that maybe is a legacy through families that has been passed along, that they're just as, you know, I've heard on a variety of shows about genealogy, finding your roots, in particular, people claiming an indigenous heritage, for example. It was surprisingly a number of people who are German American who will claim these kinds of, as if it's, and that's something also that we need to talk about, is how these different claims to Americanness, the US-ness, and also why American is being used specifically for US when it's not the only American, right? That is this. There's so many layerings of naming and how this fuels a mythology, and these and how it also shapes not just the public sphere but also the private, and how this interacts back and forth, and how these are being used in both very open and subversive ways. These symbols. So I think that there's a lot. There's so much there that I think that. As a friend and colleague mentioned at the teaching, the MLA roundtable that we had just a few days after, about teaching German and Germanic in the age of white supremacy, Adam Oberlin mentioned, it's like, what do we really know about the alt-right? What do we know about the alt-rights? The many versions, and alt-right isn't even correct, right? You have right extremists, you have white supremacists. There's so many different groups and layerings that to kind of stereotypify them. And I think that's also what happens with this use of fascism, is to oversimplify it, particularly in the same way that we oversimplify Trump supporters, which I think is something that Johannes was putting up about to pinpoint it to this rural, blue collar, Southern person, if that's where the insurrection is born. That's also not correct, right? We've seen this is not correct. And so I think we have to ask ourselves a lot more questions and not look for easy answers.
Absolutely. And maybe if I may build on that last point, and maybe just to go back to something that Johannes had mentioned earlier, which is the weaponization of free speech, and the fact that the academy or higher education or universities have been unable, I think, to productively think about the kind of response that needs to be made. And I want to think, maybe given that we're all in higher education and that we're all invested in some ways with, the response to this epistemic crisis, if we want to call it that, the assault on factuality, we can call it that, that what is the role at this point, or what can you imagine to be the role of higher education in inserting itself into these conversations in ways that's going to help to perhaps direct towards different futures, right? I'd love to hear a little bit more about your reflections about what we as faculty and leaders in higher education can and should be doing. This webinar is important, obviously, it's a step. I'd like to hear more. And I want that, because I feel like I need to be doing more myself. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I'll start, because to be honest, I stepped outside of academia to be able to have a freer voice, especially when you're an administrator. You're somewhat, basically, you can't speak for the institution, and unfortunately, most of our institutions, I can say, are very cowardly in addressing these issues, and they have reasons for that. I was a provost. I know why they are cowardly in dealing with these topics. It has a lot to do with, the donors, the, parents, students, and trying not to appear to be, too far in one direction or the other. And that's what actually the far right plays on, right? They come in and say, oh, you have to let us come and talk because you're a liberal institution, and all you care about is the left, and you don't. And I can tell you, I've been in many different institutions, and especially in political science. I mean, we bend over backwards to make sure that we aren't trying to, we certainly don't. I can tell you for sure, I do not indoctrinate my students in any way, and so there's this. That's what's, because it comes back to the discourses, right? So that's why we're seeing, the attacks on things like tenure and so on. It's being played out in this broader context of, we have to be able to control these liberal professors and what they're doing. And the reality is, there's no such thing happening. And so what I've been doing in order to fight this is, so I'll find a link, but PEN America has been doing a lot of work on free speech in higher ed, and they have a whole website about this. And so I encourage everybody to go and take a look at that. And they actually have workshops where they'll come in and tell you how to manage these free speech issues on campus. And I've done a couple webinars about this with Jonathan Friedman, who's the person spearheading this effort. And we need these outside tools, frankly. We as academics aren't really, we don't have the tools to do a lot of this work because we have to have our focus. We're teachers, we're researchers, we aren't out there in the public. So that's part of the reason I'm out there in the public sphere trying to address these issues, because it's very difficult to do as a professor, because you have, especially right now, not only do you guys all probably have, the dealing with the teaching and the research, if you have a family, so it's interesting that this situation is coming up now, because, it's one of the most critical moments, and yet we're all overwhelmed. And so I think that it's going to take, those of us who are kind of outside of academe, although I'm still very much in it, to speak up and say, we have to defend what we do because it's critical. It's so, and the funny thing to me is we have all these attacks on higher ed, and yet everybody wants higher ed. Right now I have a son who's a junior in high school, and whenever people tell me, their rights beating up on higher ed, well, those are the same people who want to see their kids going to Harvard and Princeton and Yale and Stanford and Berkeley, and they're going to beat up on higher ed at the same time as they're defunding us, but they want to send their kids there. So, and their grandchildren there. And so there's this weird situation where we're getting beat up on, and yet we're seen as this incredible commodity that people want. And we don't talk enough about this. I live in Menlo Park, California. I can tell you every parent here is fighting to get their kids into college, but they aren't fighting to keep college funded.
Yeah, I wonder, Jennifer, please. Thank you.
Yeah, very directly, I think that we have to learn new ways of doing what it is that we do. And that means sharing authority with our students, who are our best resources for getting good quality, fact-based information out there, and for also equipping them as citizens to help shape the debate. That means publishing with students. That means helping them get their voices out there in all sorts of different spheres. It also means, I think, trying to bring humanities-driven methods into conversations around platform regulation. It means taking our methods and our practices and really inserting them into high-level discussions. It also means that we need to have conversations with our universities about what protections are there for people doing very dangerous work with very difficult populations. It might be surprising to learn that most people doing this research are very early on in the process of discovering what kinds of protections they need to put into place to research these kinds of populations, that universities don't necessarily have the answers. And even maybe funding authorities are also just sort of figuring things out on the fly. So there's a lot of work that we need to do, and I think humanities are particularly well suited to this task.
Johanna.
I also want to bring up some references to a piece that came out in Foreign Affairs very recently, written by Cynthia Miller-Idris and Daniel Köhler, about the differences in transatlantic community funding and initiatives at the political level between Germany and the United States. And one of the things that they pointed out is that Germany has a comprehensive community-based anti-extremist plan that is funded by the federal government, that looks at security agencies, but does not make security the primary format or channel through which these interventions happen. And I think that one of the things that's interesting when I think about my long history with, being a German student and being an exchange student and now being a professor of German studies, is that there's been this ongoing conversation about how, in Germany, nobody volunteers because their taxes pay for things. And in America, you don't have a good tax base space, so everybody's active in church and doing something with a nonprofit and stuff like that. And this article that Cynthia and Daniel wrote is actually completely inverts that plan when it comes to anti-extremist interventions. So the American interventions, we all know that the budget has been cut for anti-white supremacy kind of, programming, and that happened during the Trump administration. But at the same time, what Biden is emphasizing is primarily this anti-extremist research through security forces, through security measures, through security as a format. And what the German plan does is create distinct and clear connections to nonprofit and social work organizations that also engaged in that day-to-day anti-radicalization effort. And that's the kind of stuff that I want to see happen in the United States, but that I also think higher education has a responsibility to participate in. I do a lot of work in Lansing with community organizations, whether that's for the classes that I teach on refugee migration across the world, where we talk with folks that do this kind of work at NGOs in the community in Lansing, or whether that means also creating the kinds of knowledge sharing that Jennifer is talking about in big data across fields or across institutions, right? I mean, Johannes and I have done this by sharing insights with various colloquia. There's places for us to do that and engage with our communities in the towns that we are like working in, even if those towns may or may not have direct context where we could use the German language or we could use German literature or something like that. There's still relevance for us to be doing that work in our localities. And I think that that's something that higher ed needs to fund, but it's also something that could really play a role in helping our students before they get to college engage with critical thought, and so that we're not fighting this fight at 18, 19, 20 years old, but that we have some support and some engagement also with the K-12 sphere, so that we know what our students will come to us with some context of civics and history and stuff like that.
Yes, thank you. And there's many ways a summary of so many of the thoughts that have already been coming, to the fore. I'm noticing that we're very close to actually over a little bit, but I do want to give the panelists an opportunity for some final thoughts or reflections, and noting that we are coming very close to the end of our session. So let me open the floor one last time to the panelists, and if anyone wants to give some final thoughts, the floor is open.
I'd just say that there's a lot of research out there that focuses on this, and everybody on this panel has been doing really great work. So I encourage everybody to just look it up, and if you have questions, reach out to us.
Just one final thought, I guess, which is we've moved laterally from the discussion of January 6th to discussion of higher education, which is completely legitimate, because in a way we're asking what's our role in understanding it and also combating it. And for that, I think I would just say two things. One is our job is becoming more and more to think about critical media literacies. I think that really needs to be part of all higher education at this point. And the second is in terms of Terri's distinction between the academy and moving outside and doing something elsewhere, which I get, and I applaud you for it. I think the academy needs to know that it is a public good. I mean, I know not all our institutions are. Many of them, most of us, no, half of us are at public institutions. We need to define ourselves as a public good without the kind of, the elitism or anything attached to it, just to understand this is the public sphere. It's not like we move from here to the public sphere or do public scholarship. We are in the public.
Please, Jennifer.
I couldn't not make a pitch for collaboration, broadly defined, new ways of doing things, new forms of allyships, trying to find ways to speak across difference, recognizing, our locatedness and what that means. I just think that that's one way. Not only is it generative and exciting and holds so many possibilities, but it really does bear fruit. And we actually really do need a village to do this kind of work. Just from my own, what I showed you, we have a team of something like 10 undergrads to postdocs. It takes a lot of energy, and there's a lot of work that we have to do. I think we all see that for what it is. So collaboration and breaking down those boundaries that have held us up in our ivory tower maybe for too long.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to welcome Nicole back online, and a couple of words to wrap up. But I want to thank the panelists. This has been such a generative conversation, and I very much hope that it will continue. And Nicole, I'm going to turn the floor back over to you.
I just want to echo Todd's words. Thank you all, Todd, for your excellent moderation, and our panelists for their great insights. You can find all of their listed works, or many of them, on their biographies for their home institutions if you want to keep reading on some of the topics. And we've put a few links for you for events at Max Kata, but also some of the different articles and things that have been mentioned throughout the event. So thank you everyone for your time this afternoon, for your wide-ranging discussion and for your insights. If we didn't get to your question, I'm sorry, but hopefully we can follow up in our smaller communities on some of these topics. So thank you everyone. Have a wonderful day.